You are live at the moment.
Well, good morning. It would have been good to see you guys this morning, and what I'm going to do is just take you through a couple of slides that I think are quite important for this next unit. In the next unit, we'll take a look at the group of writings known as the writings in the Old Testament, and here we'll look at the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and a variety of other books as we try to bring the Old Testament to a close. So in this first session, or in our TAT session for today, we're actually going to take a look at Israel's counter-testimony. So I'm going to walk you through a series of slides that help you to understand Israel's counter-testimony. Maybe just to give you the backdrop, that counter-testimony, we talk about a counter-testimony precisely because Israel has a core testimony, a testimony that they come back to again and again. And that core testimony reflects Israel's understanding of God based in Israel's experience of God. So God has shown himself to be faithful, etc. This is Israel's core testimony, and on that core testimony, Israel are fundamentally dependent. However, what we encounter in the Old Testament, and this is what makes it such a beautiful text, is a wide range of experiences where God doesn't seem to come through for Israel in the ways in which Israel expects God to come through. So let me slip over to the slides here, and then we'll work our way through them this morning. All right, Israel's counter-testimony, truth-telling in moments of absence. And that's really what we have to work with here in this counter-testimony, is that here Israel is its most honest, most truthful about where Israel finds itself in relation to Yahweh, and that's exactly what we need to wrestle with this morning. BIB1 says to us that Israel's faith is a probing, questioning, insisting, disjunctive faith. The question Israel raises in its cross-examination are not of a speculative or theoretical nature. They are questions of a concrete, practical kind, arising out of the life experience. Such questions cohere with the character of Yahweh as given in the testimony of Israel. Israel's testimony to Yahweh has proposed a God who in majestic sovereignty provides a viable life order in the world through decisive transformative interventions, a God who in generous compassion attends to the needs of Yahweh's own. But Israel's lived experience appears to deliver neither a viable life order nor generous compassion, certainly not by highly visible, nameable acts of intervention. These three different facets of Israel's counter-testimony reflect the idea of hiddenness, ambiguity or instability, and negativity. What BIB1 is drawing our attention to here is the capacity for Israel's testimony concerning Yahweh to be both positive and negative. That is to say, to highlight both those aspects where Yahweh does in fact provide a viable life order for his people and intervenes at particular moments in Israel's experience, but also at the same time holding in tension the reality that often in Israel's experience Yahweh is not present, that there is no viable life order, that there's no generous compassion, that there's no intervention on the part of Yahweh. And this is essentially Israel's cross-examination and counter-testimony, which we need to work our way through. In many ways, this sets the scene for this group of books in the Old Testament known as the writings. Let's move on to looking at what that actually looks like as we work our way through this idea this morning. There are three levels, in a sense, of Israel's cross-examination. The first level reflects a kind of hiddenness, which is not to say that Yahweh is not present, but he is present in hidden ways. And this we will pick up in more detail when we look at Israel's wisdom tradition. But then levels 2 and 3 begin to reflect a kind of instability and increasing towards a negativity, which increasingly becomes problematic for Israel, where Yahweh does not act in those transformative ways, is not generous towards Israel, in many ways seems to be completely out of the picture altogether. This leads us to reflect on 4 critical questions that Israel asks themselves in relation to their counter-testimony as they make sense of who Yahweh is. The first question is a very important one. It's the question, how long? That Brueggemann says to us, this question is raised when Israel knows that its lived experience is incongruous with Yahweh's intentionality and finds the lived experience unbearable. Israel fully anticipates that the God of its core testimony must and will act decisively to intervene and to transform unbearable circumstances. But the intervention and transformation are not on the horizon, and hence the question, how long? The question is not really a request for information or a timetable, it is rather a restless insistence that amounts to a reprimand of Yahweh, who has not done for Israel what Israel has legitimately expected. And there are a couple of passages that we could look at in relation to this particular question. So Psalm 6 verse 3, Psalm 13 verse 1 through 2, Psalm 35 verse 17, and Psalm 62 verse 3. And here the central idea is that what Israel rather intend to do with this question, how long, is not to gain information, is not to find out when things are going to suddenly turn around. In fact, what they mean by the question is to mobilize Yahweh to act. And that is critical for our understanding of the writings in particular. Israel, in this particular moment, need Yahweh to act, need Yahweh to intervene in ways that we would expect him to do. So that's our first question, how long? The second question relates to the question, why? And this question arises out of circumstance of suffering that is senseless, especially in a faith wherein Yahweh is expected to be attentive and to be helpful. This question does not ask Yahweh to give reasons or even to justify why there is an inactivity or neglect on the part of Yahweh. The question rather forms a particular kind of function. It is used as an accusation against Yahweh, who has failed to be Yahweh's true self. Again, what is reflected here is Israel's sense of who Yahweh is, and yet a kind of wrestling with how that is not playing itself out. So, for example, Psalm 22, verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? What the psalmist intends to do with these words is not to sit God down and to say, all right, now explain to me why these things are happening. Why is this senseless suffering actually taking place? The questions, as they are used in the form that they are used in, is meant to accuse God. And so we see here a very bold faith where Israel, in relationship to Yahweh, are able to ask those kinds of questions. The accusation is that Yahweh, who promised to be present and whose very character it is to be present, is notably absent. And when Yahweh is absent, bad things happen. One of the beautiful things about Psalm 22, of course, is that those opening lines are the very words that we find on the lips of Jesus in Mark chapter 16. And so it does become for us an opportune moment for us to reflect on the idea of God forsakenness. But we'll deal with that more in this unit as we work our way through the Psalms. So, how long? Why? The third question is the question where. The same issue and the same accusation are voiced with the question, the interrogative, where. The spatial reference is not asking for information about where Yahweh's attentive love has gone. The point is that Yahweh's fidelity, that is Yahweh's faithfulness, is not here. So the question where is not, well, where is it now being allocated? The question means to draw attention to the fact that it is not here. It is not in this circumstance of trouble where it is needed and where it has been rightly anticipated. And one of the examples there is Psalm 42, verse 3, which I'll read to you. Psalm 42, verse 3 says, "My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, 'Where is your God?'" Which is not a question of, so can you locate him? Do you have the GPS coordinates for where God is at that moment? Rather, it is to draw attention to the fact that God is not here. So how long, why, where, and is? This interrogative, this question is not much used in the way we are considering, but one important usage is noteworthy. In the early confrontation of the rebellion in the wilderness, the people complained for water, and by a wonder are in fact give water. But the complaint is taken as a challenge to leadership, to the leadership both of Yahweh and of Moses. So we read in Exodus chapter 17, verse 7, the following. "He called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested Yahweh, saying, 'Is Yahweh among us or not? Is Yahweh among us or not?'" And so these four questions, how long, where, and why, and is, are critical questions for understanding Israel's understanding of where God may or may not be at this particular moment. So the purpose of the questions is to mobilize Yahweh to be Yahweh's best and true self. These questions arise not in as an act of unfaith, but out of a deep confidence that the God of the core testimony that they've come to know, when active in power and in faithfulness, fidelity, can prevent and overcome such intolerable life experiences. The questions arise with such urgency because Israel finds that life without the active force of Yahweh is not good. Israel will indeed tell the truth about its life, even if that truth is costly to its testimony. But it does so in the expectation that this truth-telling will effectively summon Yahweh back to power and to solidarity. This is, I find, such a critical part of understanding the Old Testament. Israel's faith is robust enough to bring all of life to speech before Yahweh, even in those moments when that speech reflects very directly on God's lack, which is to say, on the experience of people who are not encountering Yahweh in the way that they used to encounter Yahweh. So it's such a beautiful and robust faith that is being reflected for us, though we find it quite difficult actually to make sense of this kind of truth-telling. It perhaps reflects on our own experiences where we've gone through moments where we may have asked the question, how long, where are you, why, perhaps even is, and yet found ourselves in contexts where we were not able to speak boldly those questions. We were not able to bring to speech the questions that we have about where Yahweh is and why we may be suffering what we are suffering. So the core testimony of Israel, which we are now familiar with based on what we have covered in Old Testament A, by appeal to those great transformative verbs of Yahweh, and by the derivative adjectives and noun methods of Israel's speech, all comprising Israel's core testimony, made a case that Yahweh is competently sovereign and utterly faithful. And on most days, that conclusion is adequate. It is a welcome conclusion because it issues in a coherent narrative account of reality. But Israel lives in the real world and notices what is going on around it. Israel is candid, refusing to deny what it notices, and so issues of competent sovereignty and reliable finality will remain in the Old Testament as Israel's beliefful, candid, unfinished business. But there is more going on in the relationship which we must wrestle with. So that cross-examination does not proceed frontally or in large, sweeping generalization. That's really very important. When we see Israel engaging in these moments of truth-telling in relation to Yahweh, it is conducted by the slow, attentive process of teasing out the detail, of noticing hints of incongruity that fly in the face of the main claims. And these hints accumulate, and a rereading and a re-uttering of these primary narratives is therefore required. Israel's cross-examination concerning Yahweh in the end will require a considerably revised narrative about Yahweh. So here we have the ebb and the flow of the relationship between Yahweh and his people, where Israel are able to reflect honestly, boldly, and in moments of truth where things do not seem to be quite as they should be. And that becomes very important for our understanding of this set of books known as the writings. In some ways, Israel's cross-examination builds out of that fundamental core testimony that Israel has. And in moments of exile, whether that be the Babylonian exile or whether it be exile-like moments in Israel's experience, as we encounter in the Psalms, moments of abandonment, of dislocation, for example, these are perennially about Israel's, are a part of Israel's experience, in other words. And so during these exile moments, during the exilic moments, Israel attempts a kind of resolution of one kind or another. The resolution that is deeply dependent on the reiteration of the core testimony, but that resolution doesn't always satisfy and kind of leaves an uneasiness in Israel's experience. And we know that the exile is definitional and paradigmatic for Israel, so it returns to this narrative again and again as an attempt to say, Yahweh, you took us out, but even as we affirm that, as we hook ourselves back into the core testimony, we notice, Yahweh, that you are not, in fact, present. And so in many exile-like circumstances, Israel brought evidence out of its own suffering that Yahweh's character, sovereign and merciful, did not in fact ring true, that there were moments where Yahweh is not who he says he is. And so Israel reaches into the core testimony to reiterate those foundational claims concerning Yahweh, but even as it does so, there are moments where those claims do not in fact hold true. And as we noted moments ago, that this results in Israel having to re-articulate who God is. God cannot simply remain the same in Israel's experience, because Israel's experience in life of Yahweh has been rich, has been new, has been different. And so that is exactly a part of the core testimony. So this diagram is not meant to complicate things any further, but it certainly helps us to understand that there's a core testimony. And in moments of exile, Israel dig down into the core testimony, but sometimes as they dig down, they do not find any satisfaction at all. It is evident, therefore, that Israel had to learn live, and therefore to testify in contexts where the intense engagement of Yahweh simply was not available. It is profoundly important that this lack of availability did not lead Israel to retreat from its theological claims about Yahweh or to be silent about Yahweh. It led instead to venture some alternative strategies of testimony. Yahweh was taken underground into hiddenness and inscrutability. Pardon me. But for all of that, Yahweh in indirectness and invisibility is no less decisive. Indeed, in its counter-testimony, Israel used the occasion of Yahweh's hiddenness to magnify its claims for the generous, creative, and faithful governance of Yahweh. Yahweh is, in the face of hard evidence, said to be a practitioner and guarantor of joyous, life-giving coherence, the cause of all good and evil, the one with durable intentions for well-being in Israel. And so while Israel's answers about Yahweh might be less powerful than the core testimony, it is in any case important that Israel entertained the questions, honored them, and exercised great intellectual courage and great faith in making response. While the questions posed as cross-examination are nowhere answered, we may imagine the answers that arise. Where now is your God? Here and everywhere, but in ways one cannot administer. How long? Until I'm ready. Why have you forsaken? My reasons are my own and will not be given to you. Is Yahweh among us? Yes, in decisive ways, but in ways that will not suit you. So this morning we've spent some time just working through the counter-testimony of Israel. And this counter-testimony is really very important for us to make sense of as we work our way through the writings in the Old Testament. You will find that in the next week or so, and in the next couple of weeks as we work our way through the rest of the writings, that there will be moments where your own faith, your own sense of who you are in relation to Yahweh are going to be called into question. And this is a good moment. This is a healthy moment for us. We need to be able to create spaces in which all of life is brought to speech before God. When we have those spaces, then we can entertain very seriously, very faithfully, the fact that we do not have a handle on God, that it is impossible for us to make claims that we have God pinned down. I'm going to read you a closing prayer just to reflect on some of the ideas that we have been talking through this morning. We call out your name in as many ways as we can. We fix your role towards us in the ways we need. We approach you from the particular angle of our life. We do all that not because we need to be identified, need you, because you need to be identified, but because of our deep need, our deep wound, our deep hope. And then, when we are astonished that while our names for you serve only for a moment, you break beyond them in your freedom, you show yourself yet fresh beyond our utterance, you retreat into your splendor beyond our grasp. We are by your freedom and your hiddenness made yet sure yet again that you are God, beyond us, for us, but beyond us, not at our beck and call, but always in your own way. We stammer about your identity, only to learn that it is our unsettling before you that wants naming. Beyond all our explaining and capturing and fixing you, we give you praise. We thank you for your fleshed presence in suffering and for our names that you give to us. Amen. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you guys in a couple of weeks' time for our final chat. Do email me if you have any questions about assignments, if you're having any issues, any difficulties that you need us to be picking up on. And we look forward to seeing you again.